I have a very distinct memory of trying to write it down and then showing it to my brother. Funny memory, because he looked at it, instantly he could see it seemed like Lord of the Rings. I don't remember the verbatim, but his reaction is, maybe you should try writing something original. And so that's the, I should
It's
not
like,
just copy.
you know, your characters' names are Frody and Sam.
It wasn't that bad, but it was close. It was close.
The world has gone bonkers. We now live in George Orwell's 1984. War is peace, ignorance is strength, and crazy is normal. How do you stay sane?
Dominic Sy is a fiction writer who teaches at the University of the Philippines. So, when I told my parents that I intended to become a writer, they recoiled in horror and expected from me a life of poverty and misery. Although they were not exactly wrong, huh? But how does your generation regard careers in writing?
When I told my parents about it, maybe horror is too strong a word, but reaction was also very clear they were worried about it. I don't really think I can speak for my generation, but from the people I know or from what I've seen, definitely still a lot of initial discouragement because it's not steady. There's the jobs you do get don't pay as much. That's pretty clear. And I wanted to ask you about this because from what I've seen with my friends, right now a lot of the times, especially if it's in between jobs, what you end up doing is you get writing jobs online. So there's a lot of freelance work that you can do online.
Writing clickbait.
Not always, but sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of writing jobs you can do online, jobs from random companies in America, for example. And there are all these portals to get these freelance jobs. So at least now, with my generation, for writers or people who want to make a living almost entirely through writing, that becomes, if not the main source of income, that becomes the filler almost as they look for other sources of
It's
living.
I have to pay my rent option.
Yeah. So I was actually wondering if it was the same, because I know you started out in the 90s.
Oh, obviously we didn't have the internet until the later part of the 90s.
Yeah.
So freelancers had to write for newspapers and magazines, two things which are becoming extinct rapidly.
Right.
Yeah, so we could freelance, we could submit articles to newspapers and magazines, or you could write for a public relations agency where it's like somebody launches a new shampoo and they need 10 versions of the same press release.
Right.
Yeah, that was a job then.
Right. Which is still, it's still happening. I have other friends who are like in ad agencies,
Yes.
for example. I guess it's the same. Right. You just have the internet now, but not as many newspapers and magazines.
But you do teach, so you have a job, you have a
Oh,
proper
and for
job.
me, yeah. For me, I teach. So in a way, that becomes at least as far as my parents are concerned, I was like, okay, he has a job.
It's the security.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
did you plan to become a teacher, or you figured, well, if I'm going to write, I better teach?
It's the latter. So when I was going to college, and I already knew I wanted to write by then, so I very specifically chose a literature course.
So you took comparative literature?
Yeah, comparative literature.
Yeah, so did I. And did anyone ask you what you compared? Because they certainly asked me. Comparative literature, what do you compare?
All the time.
Yes.
And I just say, we compare books.
Yes.
And they were like, okay. Is the usual reaction.
And then the next question is that a living?
Yeah.
How did you become interested in books to the extent that you majored in books?
That one's actually a kind of a funny story because at least for the first decade of my life, I did not enjoy reading, or unless you count like reading like science books, animal books, the ones for kids with the pictures and everything.
Yeah, but you leisure reading, Nancy Drew or
fiction.
whatever.
No, I didn't enjoy it. And this, I guess, very much my generation, or at least a certain group of my generation. The one that changed it was actually Harry Potter.
Aha! You're one of the Potterheads.
Yeah,
Yes.
basically. So after Harry Potter, it's like, oh, reading's fun. So I just started reading from there.
Yeah, so if only for that, as in, Planet owes J.K. Rowling something.
Yeah, a lot of problems with J.K.
kids
Rowling.
who would
but,
otherwise not have
Harry
gotten
Potter.
into reading started picking up books.
I think that, and they have done studies on that, which is a surprising amount of people when they point to Harry Potter. Oh, that's got me started reading.
And so, from becoming a reader, you thought of writing stories yourself.
Eventually.
When did it occur to you that writing was something you wanted to do?
It was weird actually thinking back about it. Thinking back on it, like memory-wise, I do have memories of writing like in grade school, but never thinking of it seriously. I remember the moment when I started thinking of it seriously, which
How old were you?
I was 13. And it was because I read another fantasy series for kids, His Dark Materials.
Oh, Philip Pullman, yes.
Yeah. So a little more advanced. So I read that, and I was very stunned by just the idea that what you could pull off. And this one, and for books for kids, in fact, what you could pull off while being fun at the same time. It's actually pretty anti-religious.
Yes, and for Savior Boy, it's like.
Oh yeah, so of course,
this?
from someone from a Catholic background, as a kid from a Catholic background with very religious parents, this is like the ultimate. It's a book for kids that's anti-religious. This
and
is
they have
possible.
they have familiars named demons. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not demonic in any way, but that's the book, right? But yeah, so that surprised me. The idea that you could discuss philosophy while also just having a fun adventure with kids.
So when you started writing for yourself, were you doing the fantasy genre or?
The very first things I was thinking of writing and trying to write was
Were there wizards in them?
No, it was more of high fantasy, I guess. I have a very distinct memory of trying to write it down and then showing it to my brother.
How old is your brother?
My brother's 4 years older than me. Funny memory because he looked at it, instantly he could see it seemed like Lord of the Rings. And I don't remember the verbatim, but his reaction is, maybe you should try writing something original. And so and I didn't really think about it, but I think over time that stuck with me. And it's like, oh wow, I should
It's
not
like,
just copy.
your characters' names are Frody and Sam.
It wasn't that bad, but it was close. It was close.
Okay, you teach English, basically.
Yeah.
Recent surveys find that the Philippines is dead last in the region for English comprehension.
Right.
Do you find this manifested in your own classes?
Well, I teach in UP, so it's a little.
They have to have passed the OPCAT, that's for sure.
Yeah, so it's not entirely representative of the population. I mean, we still have difficulties all the time. Quite naturally. If I remember right, the one study I read that said that, is that the PISA study? The one that was happening a few months ago?
I think so, yeah.
What I found interesting is that, it's a study, when you check the study, the languages they check for reading comprehension, they use many of the world's major languages, right? But that just means the big languages. Obviously, Filipinos in there. So when they did that study in the Philippines, it was a study of the reading comprehension in English. Which would naturally not be as high due to all the language issues that we have. And then I remember also, if this was the same study, if you read part of it, it says that one reason for this is probably because the Philippines has the lowest percentile in terms of investment in education per student.
Okay.
So I mean, obviously it's a big country, so maybe you invest more into education, let's say, the Dominican Republic. But if you cut it down to the actual population of the student body, we're the lowest in all the countries they surveyed. So it's not surprising. It's not surprising. You don't spend to educate your children. Or you don't spend to educate your youth.
Then don't expect results.
Yeah, basically. And then you have the language problem, right? The fact that the education system is already very problematic is based on a second language. Because it's based on a second language, you would have to invest more money to get over the second language barrier.
Right.
But we're actually investing the least. So they naturally compound. So yeah, I mean, it's terrible. It's sad.
It's a common complaint that Filipinos don't read books. Do you think this is true? Because whenever people complain to me that, Filipinos don't read books, I always point out that Fully Booked has sold thousands of copies of Edith Hamilton's mythology in the expensive hardcover anniversary edition. So at least those thousands are reading.
Right. Although I think there are some schools that would require that though. So I mean, I guess
so that
a
helps.
Requirement. Oh,
yeah,
well,
it always helps, if your book is made a school requirement.
Right. But the example I would usually think of would be, although it's not an example many people enjoy, or like if you go to a 7-Eleven you'll see Wattpad novels.
You know, Wattpad novels sell at quantities that we can only dream
Yeah.
of.
If the question is reading, at least for me, reading at any level is already good.
Yes.
And it's
As
just a
long
matter
as
of-
people read, it's fine. I don't care what they read. They
Yeah.
can read the phone book. If
Yeah.
phone books still exist.
Yeah, I would say definitely.
Yeah, and you know those annual Big Bad Wolf sales that are 24 hours? Those
Right.
things are always packed.
Right,
And people
yeah.
buy, you know, carts and carts of books. So you can't say that people don't
Yeah.
read.
And you actually have to fight for the good books. Like if you go there late, a lot of the books will be gone.
Yeah, I have friends who figured they'd go at 3 in the morning. They go at 3 in the morning. It's full. Yeah, but your first book is A Natural History of Empire, which was published last year?
Late
yeah.
last year.
So what was it like, the process of writing the stories in this book?
Yeah, well, it's actually quite a short book.
Yes,
But,
it's a short book. So
yeah.
I recommend it highly to people who complain that, you know, ang haba-haba naman ng librong yan. It's only like 100 pages of stories. So
It's funny because I was quite insecure about how short it was. And I remember my girlfriend was very insistent. No, it's good.
no, this is good. This
Because
is good
it's short.
you know, people produce doorstops.
Right.
But because people have this idea that masulit yung libro na mas
Right,
makapal
right.
because, you know, you're getting more for your money. But the question is, will you finish the doorstop?
Not as intimidating.
What was the
process.
process? Yes.
Well, a lot of those stories were actually written over a long period of time.
Like the oldest story here was written how many years ago?
The oldest story was written in 2013.
So these are the 7 stories that you like most.
Not necessarily. There were the 7 stories that they fit together best. There are some interconnections, and
So it is
Brought
quote unquote curated. That overused term, curated.
by myself, I
Yes.
guess. I suppose, yeah.
Oh, so the pieces already existed, and then there was a call for submissions.
Except 2 pieces. So one piece was written just for the manuscript because I was putting it together, and I thought, oh, it needs something more. And then the other one was like half written, and because there was a call, I was like, okay, it's time to finish it.
So do you find that contests are helpful? As in, you know, at least for getting people to finish a manuscript.
Well, getting deadlines are always helpful to getting people to finish, right?
But the particular deadline was for the Critica Cultura.
First book award, yeah.
First book award,
First book
yeah.
prize award.
Everyone who had written a first book submitted to that
Right,
contest.
right.
Yeah.
The qualification was if you didn't have a book yet, you could submit.
So there was no age requirement. So I guess technically, if you're 70 years old and you've never published a book, you can join the.
So I don't think there was an age requirement.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So it was just if you don't have a book yet, you can submit something. Yeah, again, as far as having a deadline was concerned, it was very helpful.
So it didn't matter whether it was short stories or a
No,
novel. No, as long as it's a first book.
In this case, as long as
Could
it's
it be
fiction.
nonfiction?
I think in this one it had to be fiction, or at least you had to say it was fiction, right? So
Do you always write books with a with a historical component, or it just so happened that the stories that fit together were
The
these?
stories that survived, many of them were historical, and also just I enjoy history a lot.
But writing short stories set in historical periods, of course, requires some research. So,
Oh, yeah.
were you already reading history anyway, and so
Oh, yeah.
the research kind of did itself?
It could be my brother, because my brother is a historian, also in UP. It could be because my brother randomly tells me something he finds out about something.
It's a factoid, and
Yeah.
then you just read up on it, and it grows and grows.
Right, one of the stories there actually is the second story, which is set in Mexico.
Yeah,
and
the
it
Fingers of
involves-
Santa Juana.
Yeah, so it involves a procession in Mexico. Basically, there's a scene where they're trying to grab body parts out of the corpse that's passing by.
Yes.
Basically, the entire story is based on the fact that my brother told me that this was something they did in Mexico, especially back in the past.
A corpse is in a procession, and if the corpse is that of an admirable person, they start trying to get pieces of it.
They might, yeah. So I mean, obviously, I made up some parts, right?
Okay.
But the idea was if you can get, well, there were stories of processions where that was happening, and it's also if you can get like a kind of a body part of a saint, that was a holy relic, right? This person was, by saint, of course, it's not like officially declared by the church to be a saint. It's just more of admired by the entire community, admired everyone as somebody who's very holy. And from that, I started thinking, what kind of story can you build around that? I think what happened is I knew about that, and I also knew simultaneously that there were Filipinos in Mexico, in the colonial period.
Yes.
Because many of them jump out of the galleons and they settle there.
Yeah, did you get to do any reading about that? You know, the people who abandoned the galleons. Tell us a bit about the Manila Men. They're called the Manila Men.
Yeah. There are actually certain places, I don't remember exactly where anymore, but there are actually certain places in Mexico that they tended to gather after they jump off the galleon.
So they're the original TNT.
Yeah. It goes all the way back. They were basically forced on the galleon.
It helped that they didn't have papers at the time. So.
Right. Yeah. But the thing is, it's kind of funny, and I kind of play on this in the story. Everyone in that time period, it's almost like a joke because it's still a joke in the present. If you come from the Pacific, at least in Mexico, they just refer to you as Chino. No matter which part of Asia you're from, they
even
just,
if you were
it's Chinese.
Indian.
I'm not sure about Indian actually, because they were using the word Indio to refer to themselves, right?
Yeah, right.
Because the Spanish were
so,
using Indio to
Chino,
refer to Native American. Maybe Indians would be different, but from East Asia at least. And the Filipinos definitely were being referred to as Chino. There is, if I remember right, there is a Wikipedia page if you want to check it out. It's a Filipinos in Mexico or Filipinos in Mexican history, and you can find like Mexican presidents who had some Philippine descendants, Philippine ancestors.
I remember reading in Rasil Mojares' book that one way that they established that these were Filipinos who had jumped ship from the galleons was that the stills that they used to make liquor were very similar to the stills used for making tuba or basi.
Yeah, so the galleon trade is actually very interesting when you look into the fact that...
why don't we know more about the galleon trade when that's such a huge part of our history, as in the fact of our being part of the Spanish Empire at all has a large... No, wait, can I offer you something to drink?
Oh, just... water, I guess.
Can we have some water, please? Our assistant Gambo will give it to you. Yeah, so, you think boats and, sailing are boring?
No, but the way it's taught in history class, right? The way it's taught in history is...
Everything taught in history class is kind of boring.
It's the method of teaching. But it is interesting when you really get to look at it.
Like recently, because to go to the public domain review, books that have gone back into the public domain, they feature and then they write articles. I was reading randomly, there was this piece on how scurvy was the scourge of early sailors, right?
Because they didn't have enough vitamins.
They didn't have vitamin C. Apparently, one of the effects of scurvy, of a vitamin C deficiency, was that sailors' imaginations would become hyperactive, and they would get super duper emotional.
And so you get all these stories, interesting, mysterious stories, or mysterious things happening
we landed and there were giants.
Which makes it interesting when you go like 19th century, let's say American European literature, and you have all these like horror stories set in the sea.
And sidebar, in Moby Dick, there's a mention of Manila Men. As in, Filipinos were already known for their sailing prowess.
Yeah.
Because how can we not have sailing prowess? We're all islands.
We're all islands, and then the Spanish come and force us to go on their boats.
Right.
So from hundreds of years, we are sailors.
Yeah, and then your next story is set in the Philippine-American War, of which Filipinos know very little.
Right, yeah. The story is slightly based on...
It's an actual hunt.
None of the characters are, except for William Howe Taft, the American governor. None of the characters are real, but the general idea was based on what happened to... The story of Sakai and what happened with Mabini when he got back from Guam.
Please write a novel about Mabini, because I feel that Mabini doesn't get the attention that he deserves.
Mabini is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Like, its ideas, nowadays there's a very common like analysis or perspective which is challenged, but it's a perspective of seeing like Aguinaldo basically when he took over the revolution, there was almost like a class element when he took over the revolution.
Yes, and Mabini was never pro.
And actually, Mabini kind of already was stating that. All the way back.
He's like, there's going to be trouble.
Yeah. So he, even though of course he was part of Aguinaldo's government, right? So he, quite interesting, even from all the way in the past, he was seeing things slightly differently from everybody else. Things that would be picked up on later by other people.
Yeah, and I remember watching the movie on Gregorio del Pilar, and by far the most interesting character was Mabini. And he couldn't even get up from his seat. So he was carried everywhere. So.
Physically, you would stereotypically say he's weak. He was at least internally probably the sturdiest, the strongest of everybody.
Exactly.
There were only two people who didn't surrender, which was Mabini and Ricarte. Ricarte never surrendered. He came back with the Japanese.
Yeah, but Ricarte's kind of...
Ricarte's an entirely different story. But the last person to surrender was Mabini. And it was only because he wanted to be buried in the Philippines.
Right. Are
Yeah,
you
yeah.
planning to write anything about Artemio Ricarte?
I have thought about it just because he's so interesting.
Yes, because I remember at the National Historical Institute, they used to sell copies of his autobiography,
Oh,
where he
really?
called himself El Víbora, as in
Right,
the
yeah, yeah,
Viper,
yeah,
like, you know, pre-Game of Thrones, the Viper.
Yeah.
And when I was leafing through it, I said, this man is obviously cuckoo because he always referred to himself in the third person. As in, El Víbora went to the door, El Víbora had lunch, El Víbora called a taxi, whatever. So, you know.
Yeah.
And then he never surrendered, but then he went to Japan. He opened the Carinderia.
Right.
And then he came back with the Japanese invading army.
Right.
Yes.
When the Philippine movement for independence arrived, when they fought for independence, in a way it wasn't just the Philippines, because all the countries around the Philippines were paying attention, especially like in Indonesia, for example. In Hong Kong became like a kind of base
For Aguinaldo and Company.
But that's also because a lot of Asian activists were meeting in Hong Kong. So you had Japanese
So Hong Kong was
intellectuals.
always an international city.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, when the British took over, they turned it into an international port. Because of that, lots of people from different places were coming over. The academic term is Pan-Asianists. A lot of Asian nationalists from different countries would meet up in Hong Kong. Stories of like Mariano
Ponce, yes.
meeting with Sun Yat-sen, who was the head of the Chinese Revolution, or who became like the leader of the Chinese Revolution. They would meet. All these different people meeting in Japan and in Hong Kong. And so there's a lot of Asian independence movements where they were kind of buddies with each other.
Yeah.
Not super close, but,
But
they
you
knew
know,
of
they
each
were
other.
contemporaries.
So when Ricarte refused to surrender, he escaped to Japan, and he, in his mind at least, he was keeping the nationalist movement alive.
No. El Víbora is keeping
that's
the
right.
nationalist
That's right.
movement
Yeah.
alive. Yeah.
And so then you fast forward. When you go with the Sacdalistas, for example, because I'm doing research right now on the Sacdalistas.
On the Sacdalistas.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So the Sacdalistas are quite interesting because they're kind of known as collaborators, which is a little unfair. Some of them did become collaborators.
Why
Most
are
of
they
them
called
not.
Sacdalistas again?
Because they started with a newspaper called Sacdal.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the newspaper, it was based on, I don't know how you pronounce it, but it's based on a French newspaper, J'accuse or something like that.
J'accuse,
Yeah,
the
from
Zola,
Zola,
and
yeah.
Dreyfus, yes.
And the idea was they're accusing government officials.
Nakasakdal, the accused, yes.
Basically, they're
yeah.
saying you guys are corrupt. And so a lot of the articles would be like articles on salaries of the government officials. And not all of them, but a lot of them were like salaries of government officials. This is how much Quezon is earning here. This is how much Osmeña is earning. This is what Rojas and Osmeña and Quezon are doing in America. This is how much you earn as a government official in the Philippines. Compare that with the government official in England. And they'll compare salaries. It's a lot of it's just saying that the government that exists and the government they're about to set up, which is the Commonwealth, they're saying it was incredibly corrupt.
Oh God, this is such an old story.
Oh,
no?
yeah.
And it's still going on.
Actually,
And
if you read these old newspapers, you'd be like, oh,
It's
you just
like
change the
nothing
names.
has changed.
You change the names, you change some of the numbers, and it's just like, oh, it's the same. It's the same problem. The Sacdalistas were quite interesting. They began very much as just a nationalist pro-independence movement, but their primary goal was independence. And so, because of what I was saying, with like Asian countries tended to look to one another to see if what they were doing for independence. Some Asian groups in the 30s were looking at Japan because Japan was the only modernizing Asian power. China was independent, but still very...
finally opened itself up.
Right,
you know.
right. They were industrializing very fast. They were a modern Asian power. They were an empire. They were invading China at the time. So they were looking at that and were saying, we have to emulate that. We have to be like Japan. And Ricarte happened to be there. Right? So you have some articles actually would talk about Ricarte, and these Sacdalistas were saying, Ricarte, the guy who kept the revolution alive, basically. And then Benigno Ramos, who was the founder of the Sacdalistas, who was also a very important Filipino poet, actually, as in a writer in Tagalog. Sort of like exiled, but sort of just made his way to Japan to try to raise money. And for a long time, he was just in Japan.
Okay.
When the Japanese invaded, came back with Ricarte, and Benigno Ramos eventually allied with the Japanese, and that's when it became tainted with.
Okay, and
with
that
being
was the beginning
collaborators.
of his career as a collaborator.
Yeah. So when you look back at the Sacdalistas, they're like, oh, they're the ones who became the Makapili.
Which is another dark chapter of Philippine history that we
Right.
know very little about. And then what triggered this interest in the Sacdalistas?
Oh.
Is it going to be short stories or a novel?
It is at the moment 2 novellas that are nowhere near close to done, but they're.
But they're
they'll be
stewing,
intersecting.
and
Yeah,
something will happen there. It's interesting because you're mining a very interesting field that we know little about, but
Right.
is so rich in possibilities.
One of the classes I'm teaching is Southeast Asian literature. It's maritime Southeast Asia, so it's Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. But so the way I teach it is it's kind of evolving over time, and how the literature in these places aren't separate. There are a lot of movements. There's a lot of the same issues happening, if not at the same time, almost at the same time, and they're learning from one another. They're paying attention to one another.
Right.
And I will always bring up, and then if you compare it in the Philippines, this is what's happening in the Philippines at exactly the same time. So when the British
Interesting,
were
yeah.
building rubber plantations in Malaysia, and the Dutch were building sugar plantations in Java,
in Java.
it's the exact same time that the British companies, now that Spain has opened itself up, were building sugar plantations in Negros. We actually lost that competition because in the 19th century, the world's biggest sugar producer was Java, not Negros.
Really?
So it was all happening at the same time. In the end of the 19th century, for us, it was a transition between colonizers. But for Malaysia and Indonesia, it was the same colonizer. It was still Britain or still the Dutch, but they changed their tactics. The Dutch changed the entire policy of how they colonized Indonesia, focused more on education, which when the Americans came, right, that's what they were saying. Part of the idea was it will be so much more profitable and cheaper for us if we just train the natives to manage the stuff themselves. We'll just sit back and
we
earn
won't have to
yeah.
bring in people from the other side of the world anymore.
Right, yeah,
Right.
basically. And many Europeans actually did not want to go from the other side of the world all the way. It's such a huge expense.
Yeah, and it would take months.
Yeah.
Plus scurvy. So we can have a long conversation about, Philippine history
Right.
and the stories that we can write about Philippine
Right.
history. But the sad thing is the general public
Right,
seems to
right.
be ignorant
Right.
of history. As in, we need look no further than, a generation that is not aware that the Marcos dictatorship
yeah.
happened. And there are some pretty good novels set in the Marcos
Right,
period.
yeah,
There's
yeah,
novels
yeah.
by Butch Dalisay, by Arcelos.
Right. Until now, there's a lot of people still writing about the martial law period. Precisely because nowadays it's precisely because there's the shock and horror that no one understands it or remembers it properly, right? I mean, I guess if you go back to what we were talking about earlier, lowest expenditure for education. Per student.
And we reap what we have sowed.
Right.
Based on the stories in your book, I will guess who your favorite authors are.
Okay.
Jorge Luis Borges.
Definitely one.
Take care of your eyesight.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
because he goes blind. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then Gina Apostol,
Right.
who writes a lot about historical periods as well, in Insurrecto, in Reynaldo
Right.
Mata.
She actually has an essay. She had an essay a few years ago. I think it was just in her blog on Borges. It made me feel better, basically. In terms of liking Borges, and in terms of what you can do or what you should be doing or trying to do with fiction.
And then, do you have like a regular procedure for writing stories? As in, do you sit down and write an outline, or you read around the subject first and then you sit down and write it from beginning to end?
I hear it's always not what you're supposed to do. But because
There's some truth to that, yeah.
right, even from the very beginning when I started wanting to write, it was very much based on this idea that writing can impart ideas
Yeah.
and can develop ideas in
Yes.
the writing itself. And so, in a way, my writing is always very idea heavy. And so a lot of the times I end up mulling over an idea for a long
yeah,
period of time.
it won't hurt to have a little humor.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
I have been told that
Yes.
multiple times.
Well, humor just makes everything go
Yeah.
down easier, yeah.
Right. I'm trying to work on it.
Okay.
I promise. But yeah, so I mull over it, and then once the writing process actually begins, I actually have a tendency to write by hand first.
I always
for a
write
lot
by
of it.
hand. There's nothing
Right,
like
yeah,
cursive, yeah.
It kind of weeds out all the other distractions that exist and anything else that you can write
Yes,
with.
because you have to focus.
It's just the paper and the pen. And
Yeah.
then at some point I'll transfer it to a
computer, yes.
And then usually it comes through like multiple drafts. Like one of the stories in that book was like had 10 drafts, I think.
So you're a multiple drafts person.
Yeah.
How do you know when, it's finished, you don't want to do any more drafts?
Haha.
You just know.
I don't know.
So
Sometimes I
it's
look
like,
at it now.
the deadline is now, so it's
Right.
finished.
So going back to the deadline is helpful. It stops you from rewriting it the 10th time.
Yes.
Right, say, okay, whatever, just whatever this is. Let's see how that works.
In an increasingly insane world, how do you maintain your sanity? Saying, we're in the middle of a bit of a mental health
Right.
crisis period.
Right.
So
And,
you hear a lot about depression, suicide, and so on.
Right.
So how do you keep an even keel?
I'm almost entirely off social media.
Which I recommend highly.
It's
yeah.
a nightmare.
At the very least, limit your exposure to
Right, right. Although, in my case, it has led to the reverse problem where I'm so hard to contact that my friends have given up contacting me.
Oh. They should go back to the old-fashioned methods, texting, calling.
I'm not very good at it. Even with texting, I sometimes I have one friend who I tend to reply to once a month. Some of the friends
Okay.
some of the friends I made in
You're
Indonesia
one of those.
were
Yeah.
so angry because they emailed me and then I emailed back 5 months later. So I'm a bit
Try
of the
to get
extreme
back to
version.
them within the week.
Yeah. So extreme version. But yeah, I mean, at least for the sanity part.
But
Yeah.
friends are good for sanity maintenance.
That's true. That's true. That's why I am trying to fix the never replying part.
Yes, as in, start
Yeah.
replying to them. It'll help.
Yeah. You can't open yourself up too much to the world, but you can't be completely isolated, right?
Right. And
there's
so,
some
what's your personal deadline for your next book?
Yeah, I was thinking 29.
Oh,
30,
29, yes.
30 is probably more realistic.
Yeah, well,
But,
29.
Yeah. I think because one thing that does happen, at least in Philippine literature a lot, is books don't come out very often, understandably, right? Because we're just doing so many things. It's hard. It's a smallish. Very few people buy, let's say, Philippine authors.
That's true. Yes.
You being one of the only exceptions. Right?
But it's still not a living.
Right.
Yeah.
So already one of the only exceptions, right? And it's still
Still not enough. Yeah.
You have to do other things.
No, the thing is to just keep writing, and then whatever fits together, you publish together as a book. It helps to have a huge bank
Right,
of books, of books that you have written.
So yeah, the idea would be 2 or 3 years, hopefully. We'll see what turns out.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Coming over.